I've done videos in the past on many Fazbear Fright stories, as well as all 3 stories from the first Tales from the Pizzaplex book, discussing all details I noticed that I thought were worth noting and talking about. At the end of these videos, I would discuss a theory that I crafted based on the story. In this video, I'll be doing that for the first story in the second Tales from the Pizzaplex book, and that story is Help Wanted. Help Wanted is a very interesting story, showcasing the story of the indie game developer mentioned in FNaF VR. But this reveal and what it entails through the newer Tales stories now seems to go a lot deeper than just this singular story might lead us to believe. So that's what we'll be talking about in this video. First, we'll talk about all the details I found in the story, and then we'll talk about Help Wanted and how its reveal goes much deeper than we thought. Number 1. As we all know, the main character of Help Wanted, Steve Snodgrass, is the in-universe Freddy indie game developer, and considering in FNaF VR a picture of Scott was used for him, it's obvious that Steve is a parallel to Scott. However, the story implies that in more ways than one. Not only does he make horror games about murders at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, but he also works crappy jobs and was working on a game called Chip Off the Old Block before he started working on the Freddy games. Scott Cawthon, before making FNaF, was mostly making unsuccessful games and worked crappy jobs, and his last game before FNaF was Chipper & Sons Lumber Co. Chipper & Sons, just like how the game Steve is working on before the Freddy games was Chip Off the Old Block. Clearly it's intentional. Obviously Scott didn't meet a Fazbear Entertainment robot on a dating app which forced him to make games for them, which also ended up getting him killed. That obviously didn't happen, thank God. But the similarities are clearly there. Most of you guys probably already knew this stuff, but I just wanted to mention it. Number 2. While many people latch onto the idea that Steve Snodgrass was hired as the indie game developer after the events of FNaF 6, what's strange is that HandUnit claims in FNaF VR that the rumors that were supposedly caused by the games happened over the last few decades. That means that the games had to have been made over the last few decades from when FNaF VR happens. Otherwise, the lie wouldn't work at all, and people actually do believe them as pressure claims. Considering FNaF VR seems to be in the mid-2020s, that would place the creation of the games likely in the 2000s or maybe the 2010s, but even that's stretching it a little. Considering the only Fazbear rumors at this point were about the murders and nothing about fires, this is much more likely before FNaF 6 and FNaF 3. In that case though, how can FNaF 3 be one of the games that Steve makes if FNaF 3 hadn't happened yet when he made the games? Don't worry though, that question and more will be answered later on in this video. Number 3. This detail is something that probably means nothing, but it's something I just wanted to bring up. Help Wanted is all about telling the story of the indie game developer who made the in-universe Freddy games. Now the reason this is important for this detail is because Steve's best friend is named Matt. Matt is the name of the protagonist of the Fazbear Fright story In the Flesh, which is about the creation of a Five Nights at Freddy's VR game. It's absolutely not the same Matt, but I just find it weird that Steve, the game developer, is friends with the character who shares a name with a game developer from another story. Again, most likely means nothing, just wanted to mention it. Number 4. This detail contains some spoilers for the Tales story Didophobia in the leaked Tales Book 8, so if you don't want spoilers, skip to the time on screen. When I first started this series around 2.5 years ago, when I read Into the Pit for the first time, it started off as random small details that I noticed in these stories. Usually those details would be ones that I've never actually seen anybody talk about. Over time, the series has evolved, obviously adding the theory aspect at the end of the video, but while it started as tiny details most people don't notice, nowadays it's kind of evolved into basically everything that I notice. Some are still small details that most people don't notice, but sometimes it's also just lore that the story provides, even if everybody knows about it. And sometimes I talk about inconsistencies, like I do with the Fazbear Frights graphic novels and stuff. While I don't always discuss all the lore in these videos, a lot of the details I bring up are sometimes obvious, but I just feel like it's important to talk about them. This detail is no different, but at the same time it is different because while obviously I'm mentioning it at surface level, I'm also mentioning a deeper meaning behind it. The illusion discs. Throughout the story, Steve is tortured by a high-pitched ringing sound which at nighttime was coupled with dreadful monstrous sounds and creatures. This is very clearly the result of illusion discs, as it matches perfectly what we see in the Twisted ones. The interesting thing about this is that the novel trilogy shows that Henry built the illusion discs and Afton stole the technology. I used to say that the same happened in the games, and Afton used them for the Nightmare animatronics, which are pretty similar in terms of design to the Twisted animatronics. But with Didophobia, we now know that the illusion discs weren't used for the nightmares. Instead, it was just hallucinogenic gas. So if the illusion discs weren't used for the nightmares, were they still created by Henry? Did Afton use them at all? And most importantly, how did Fazbear Entertainment even obtain them? Honestly, I don't really have a solid answer, so I'll just leave the question for you guys to ponder. I should also mention before we reach the section of the video that passes by the part with the spoilers that the next point also does tie in with Didophobia, though I won't explain how. I'm sure you guys would be able to figure it out though if you know the basic plot of the story. Number 5. I've talked about this in previous videos, but the Tales stories have a big emphasis on the idea of fake, warped, or altered realities. It's something that we first saw in the first Fazbear Fright story Into the Pit and reappeared in the later epilogues, but it wasn't a common theme or anything. In Tales though, the concept has appeared a lot. Under Construction was the first time the concept was explored so blatantly, and it was the first appearance in Tales, but it then went on to appear in various other stories, including Help Wanted. Help Wanted shows Steve living in a fake house, completely empty, with illusion discs causing him to think that everything is real. The house is said to be snowed in, trapping him in and cutting him off from the rest of the world, and his family is made up of robots with illusion discs. The story continues the trend of fake, altered, or warped realities, and I find that very interesting. I think now that Ruin has come out, it may have been alluding to the AR world with a Vanny mask from Ruin, but who really knows for sure. Number 6. This isn't really a huge lore thing, it's just something that I wanted to mention just because it's kind of weird. In this story, Steve is tricked into believing that he had gotten into a car accident, and over the past 6 years or so, he would often forget things. Considering his older child is 4, she was probably conceived around 5 years ago. Just for good measure, to add a bit of sense to the story, Steve's memory cutoff was probably around 6 years or more ago. Obviously, we all know from towards the end of the story that this is all a complete lie. Steve was not on a car accident and didn't have memory loss. However, he believes he does, and I feel like he should be more suspicious considering everything that happens in the story. Not only does he not question the fact that he and Victoria haven't aged a day and look exactly the same, but he also doesn't question the fact that Fazbear Entertainment, even after around 6 years, has not either found someone else for the job or just cancelled the project in general. Let me reiterate, I'm not saying this story is true or anything like that. I know it's all a lie. I'm just saying that it's kinda weird that Steve just doesn't notice the big holes in this story. Also, I will never understand why Fazbear Entertainment went to such great lengths to get Steve for the job of all people. The fact that they found him despite him being a really small indie game developer on its own is weird, but if no one has paid attention to his games in the past, why does Fazbear Entertainment suddenly think that everyone will find and play Steve's Freddy games, and also believe that it was all just fiction? I just don't get why Fazbear Entertainment thinks that this plan will work. Don't get me wrong, I really like Help Wanted as a story, and obviously the plan does end up working. I just think there's a few parts of it that don't really make a whole lot of sense. Number 7. Right around the midpoint of the story, Steve's robot daughter Abigail was making noise by bumping into the furniture repeatedly. Since she's a robot, this makes perfect sense, she's probably glitching or something. Another thing that ties into this is that Victoria tells him that she's a light sleeper and that she didn't hear anything. This is probably meant to be a hint that both of them are robots and working towards the same goal. What's interesting about this though is the fact that Victoria says that the kids sleepwalk often, which is supposedly something that they get from Steve. This may not seem like much at first, but it becomes interesting when you realize that these are robots made by Fazbear Entertainment. Fazbear robots always move around at night, and while that's mostly just because of the spirits possessing the animatronics, Fazbear robots moving around at night in this story could possibly be a reference to the Fazbear robots throughout the series also moving at night, but I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. But maybe it's not actually glitching that's causing Abigail to bump into the furniture repeatedly. Like I said, we'll talk about that later. Number 8. This next point is very likely a stretch because a couple things just don't add up about it very well, but I thought it was worth mentioning, or maybe it's not, I just wanted to say it because, you know, why not? Around the beginning of Steve's life in the simulated house, his daughter and son wake him up for pancakes. The reason I'm bringing this up is because in the final Fazbear Frights epilogue, while Larson is cycling through different time periods, in one of them, the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza building, which following the missing children incident was repurposed by many different companies, was now a restaurant called Papa Bear's Pancake House. Now, obviously Steve's family isn't the only one in existence that likes pancakes, but it is mildly interesting that the family in the restaurant is a family of 4, just like Steve's family in Help Wanted. There is definitely the problem of Steve seemingly never leaving his house in Help Wanted and the fact that they eat the pancakes at home, and that definitely is an issue with this connection. The only reason I'm bringing this up though is that we see that in the final epilogue when Larson is going through different Eleanor-induced memories. While the restaurant isn't one of the memories, it seems to be a memory that was in the same time period as the memory with the kid's bedroom, which is immediately shown when Larson gets into the ball pit at the pancake house. The reason I think all of this is worth mentioning is because while it's entirely possible she isn't, it seems sort of implied here that Eleanor may be a part of this story. Now, obviously it's mostly Fazbear Entertainment scaring Steve to give him inspiration for the games, but the first time we see one of these things happen, there's slithering in the walls, which also happens in The New Kid, which seems to be the work of Eleanor. And right after the slithering in the walls happens, there's a strange black bubble that forms on the wall, and then it pops, and then black liquid comes out of it. Where else do we see something like this happen? In the final epilogue, Eleanor creates tentacles, and these tentacles are formed from black blood. Coincidence? Probably, honestly. I just wanted to mention it because I'm here to talk about stuff, and this is stuff, so, yeah. Honestly, I think this is probably not true at all. I just wanted to mention it because, like, I don't know, for fun, I guess. Number 9. Right before that black bubble forms on the wall, Steve is about to exit his bedroom to escape the sounds from around him, but then he hears the same sounds coming from other areas in the house. So now he decides that he wants to stay in the bedroom rather than leave. He tried to close the door to the bedroom, but it was pointless because there was no way to lock himself inside and lock anything else outside. Now, I don't know how many of you guys have used a door before, but I think it's pretty easy to tell that Steve is being stupid here. Or his house was made in an alternate reality where the DCEU was structured like the MCU and was actually successful or something. Because you cannot lock a door to a room from the outside. That defeats the purpose of a room. That would mean that you could just be chilling in your room and anyone could just walk past and decide to trap you inside forever. If that was how it worked, the locks on a house would be counterintuitive because intruders would literally just be able to unlock it. They don't need keys or anything. And it's not even that Steve is just trying to say that there's no lock on his bedroom door because of the way that it's phrased. It says that there's no way to lock yourself inside and keep intruders out, indicating it's referring to doors in general and not just his bedroom door. Basically, Help Wanted just doesn't understand how doors work. Number 10. At this point, I think it's very clear that while the first 6 FNAF games are games in universe, that the games are still 100% canon. The events were entirely real, even if they were made as games later on. Now, I will have to explain exactly how this works with my idea about the story later on, but I think that while Steve definitely did some research into the Fazbear rumors, that he mostly just made whatever. However, we know that Fazbear Entertainment did sort of torment him with the nightmarish creatures, which inspired him with more horror. We also know that his family is a bunch of Fazbear robots, which were definitely controlled by Fazbear Entertainment. I think it makes a lot of sense if not only the nightmarish experiences from the illusion discs gave him a great deal of horror to pour into the games, but also that some of the things that those nightmares did and some of the things that his family did were meant to give him ideas about specific truthful events that happened in Fazbear history for Steve to incorporate into his games. For example, we know for a fact that the animatronics did move around at night, and we know that the kids went missing and possessed them. And we also know that springlock suits exist and were used to lure the kids. But I think that ideas like this were kind of hinted at in Steve's horror experiences so that he could kind of think of them himself. And what I mean by this is that Steve's kids move around at night, and given he'd heard about paranormal rumors about Fazbear Entertainment, he could have decided to make the animatronics move around at night, and since it was his kids doing that, he could have decided to make the missing kids possess the animatronics. Speaking of missing kids, when Steve is playing hide and seek with his daughter, Steve feels immense dread that he'd never find her, and thinks about real kids that go missing, and he could have incorporated that into the game. And finally, there's a weird thing in the story where Steve found a bunch of random cuts all over his body, and that could have made him think about the concept of springlock suits since the murders were caused by someone in a mascot costume. So these cuts could have given him the idea about these suits being dangerous and causing deep cuts throughout your body. Let me reiterate, these things did happen and they did exist. It could have simply been that Fazbear Entertainment wanted these elements in the games to ensure that people believed them to be fake. So they made Steve's robot family and horror experiences do certain things that would inspire Steve to make these elements himself. Number 11. Something I think a lot of people miss in this story is that Steve never actually finishes all 4 games. Well, yes, he was supposed to make all 4, he actually dies on the same night that he finishes Game 3. That's pretty important to consider, but what's kind of weird here is that during dinner, Steve thinks about how he is halfway through the 3rd game, and then after dinner that very same night, he doesn't continue working on the game. He just spends time downstairs happily with Victoria, the woman he loves. So annoying when people are happy in love. But the weirdest thing about this is that despite not continuing to work on the game he was just halfway done, it's then said later in the exact same scene where he stated he was halfway done, that now he was on to the 4th game. Obviously, that doesn't make any sense. It's also important to note that he doesn't actually begin to work on the 4th game either, so there isn't a prototype version of FNAF 4 anyway. But wanna know something even weirder? One day, Steve is working on the 2nd game. The next day, he's halfway through the 3rd. and then he's finished. He literally completed the entire third game in one day. That is more than ridiculous, especially when you consider that it took Scott Cawthon usually much more than one day to just model a character in his game, and somehow Steve is out here finishing an entire game faster than Scott can model a character. Sure, makes perfect sense. Still though, just wanted to mention that Steve only makes 3 games and dies before starting work on the 4th. Number 12. This last thing doesn't really add a whole lot, but it's just something that I think makes sense. DJ Dan the Music Man, who is probably a reference to the animatronic Music Man himself, is able to see everything that's happening, knows the situation Steve has found himself in, and can hear everything that's happening, including what Steve says in response to DJ Dan's voice itself. Since he's really personal with it and knows everything about Steve, is it possible DJ Dan is actually Brock Edwards, the guy who hired Steve? Brock Edwards actively knows exactly where Steve lives and shows up coincidentally as soon as Steve finds out he supposedly needs money. When Brock Edwards originally tried to hire Steve, he knew a lot about his life. Obviously, other members of Fazbear Entertainment most likely knew about the whole Steve plan, but DJ Dan being Brock Edwards isn't too far-fetched. But that's everything I noticed during my time rereading Help Wanted. But as I said at the beginning of the video, there's a lot to this story now that we've gotten more tales from the Pizzaplex books. See, I don't think that the horror games that Steve makes are the FNaF games that we play. I don't think that the FNaF 1 to 3 recreations that we play in FNaF VR are in-universe VR recreations of the games that Steve made. We do know that Steve was hired to make 4 games but then died and finished only 3 of them. We know that in FNaF VR there are only 3 sections of minigames specifically named Five Nights at Freddy's games, and while that used to be pretty convincing and it's what most people believe, I really think that we were actually wrong. The games that Steve made are not the first 3 FNaF games that we played. Now, I realize so far that this is all talk, but I think when you hear what I have to say, you may agree, or at the very least be intrigued. The Tales story Pressure from the 3rd Tales from the Pizzaplex book was one of the more lore-filled stories from the series. Not the most lore-filled, of course, but it is up there. It's a very interesting story, but there's a couple details in the story that I think a lot of people miss. When Luca is in the Springtrap costume, there's a part where he hears the voice of Balloon Boy somewhere else in the building, which he likens to what we know as FNaF 3. He remembers Balloon Boy's voice being used to lure Springtrap, but what's really important here is where his memory of it comes from. Luca remembers Balloon Boy's voice luring Springtrap from one of the VR games, not one of the indie developer games. What we know as FNaF 3 was not an indie developer game. It was specifically made for the FNaF VR game in-universe. Luca also refers to the games a lot in Pressure. He refers to a game where you close doors, which is FNaF 1, a game where you hide in animatronics, which is FNaF 2 with a mask, and one where you crawl through vents, which is Sister Location. But he refers to these as games that Fazbear Entertainment made, not games that the indie developer made. In-universe, the public believes that the indie developer acted alone, meaning if he thinks that FNaF 1, 2, and Sister Location were Fazbear Entertainment games, and FNaF 3 was only in the VR game, that heavily implies that all the FNaF games from FNaF 1 to 6 were games made by Fazbear Entertainment. FNaF 1, 2, and 3 were only made specifically for the VR game, and the other games could either be in Help Wanted 2, or could be made after the events of FNaF VR. We also know FNaF 6 was made as a game since the Monty Within mentions the Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator game, which is of course FNaF 6, and as I said, Pressure alludes to the Sister Location game with the vent crawling, and that heavily implies that all the first 6 FNaF games were games. But Steve only made 3 games, so if all the first 6 games are games, why would only 3 be made by the indie developer and the rest by Fazbear Entertainment? This would all also explain how other games like Sister Location, FNaF 4, and possibly even FNaF 6 in the future can appear in one form or another in FNaF VR 1 and 2. Steve simply didn't make them. Fazbear Entertainment did. Yes, he was inspired to put stuff like Springlocks and Missing Kids and Robots, which are kids moving around at night, into the games, but while those are in the original FNaF games, the games are not the same. So now the only question is what games Steve did make. Maybe we've seen them before somewhere else, or maybe we could see them in some form at some point in the future. But anyways guys, I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to, and let me know in the comments what you think of the theory, whether you agreed or disagreed and why. But with all that being said, I'll see you all in the next video. Bye guys!